there is not, in fact, a incredibly wealthy outside actor that believes it can control the region that is unresolvedly, implacably hostile to the idea of democracy.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am Rory, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morris. How are you this week?
Not bad. Nothing to complain about. It's beautiful weather here in New York, which hasn't been for a while.
So it's a bit cooler, or is it too warm for you?
It's a bit cooler. It's nice. I don't even have an air conditioner on, which is almost unheard of for August in New York.
Brilliant. So this episode, what makes it kind of sad for me is this is a topic I'd put forward maybe a couple of months ago as in like a good news story, because I'm always trying to get some of the better news. And Bangladesh is a country that's had a much better recent history than a lot of its neighbours, but sadly we're not talking about it today because everything's gone well.
No, I'm not entirely sure about that. I'd say things are going... Bangladesh is certainly been looked at as a bright spot economically for the past decade or so. It's sort of an emerging economic miracle. Politically, however, that has not been the case. There's been this real mismatch between the happy economic story of Bangladesh and the political stagnation or even a fall into authoritarianism. So, there's a lot of ways this could go wrong, but I think we're still at a very hopeful moment in Bangladesh, and actually one where the kinds of promises of liberalization might actually be coming true. Bangladesh is a country that has become much richer, and possibly what we're seeing here is a much richer country becoming more democratic. It could all go off the rails, but what's been happening in Bangladesh in July and August is still, I think, one of the most exciting and potentially positive developments this year.
Considering it's next door to Burma/Myanmar, which just seems to be in a constant state of civil war, like what has happened in Bangladesh since the 1980s can only be praised.
Yeah, well, that too is a broader statement than I would be
fistfuls of salt
willing to make. But it does seem, especially considering where Bangladesh started off from in 1971 compared to where Burma started off from in 1947, it does seem that Bangladesh has been doing a better job. I thought it might be interesting to just go all the way back to the beginning of Bangladeshi or Bengal engagement with British imperialism, and just a little bit further back than that as well, to talk about just what a incredible series of obstacles that the modern country of Bangladesh has overcome. And I think if we understand the number of obstacles that the country has overcome, then we'll get a better sense of perhaps why its politics since 1971 have been such a raging dumpster fire.
So what is the makeup of the country when Britain is in control?
One of the sort of factoids that always stuck out in my head is that when Clive and other members of the British East India Company took over Bengal in the 1750s, most agree that Bengal was significantly richer than the entire United Kingdom at that point.
Incredible.
The amount of, the population was much higher. It was a traditional trading hub. It was a traditional hub of the textile industry. The textile industry was the mechanization of the textile industry was the base layer of the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the United States, even before railroads. And they stole that industry from Bengal, from other regions in India. So the British learned, their textile industry learned to industrialize from their interactions with India, and obviously figured out ways to do it on a broader scale and more successfully, and made India quite subservient by the 1750s.
So their understanding of textiles goes back like millennia, is that what you're saying?
The state of the art of textiles for, yes, I think millennia, was found in India. The start at the beginning of the British East India Company's relationship with India, what it was mostly doing was importing Indian textiles into Britain because they were so much better than anything that the British could offer there. Over time, the British figured out how to use the technologies that they had in India and also figured out how to surpass them, specifically in terms of mechanization and mass production. And one of the things that the East India Company did once they'd figured out how to do a better job in Manchester, Birmingham, sort of the industrial north of England, is they shut down that Indian industry that they learned everything from.
So they just meant they were more for raw materials at that point?
Yes. And of course, the United States even supplanted that as sort of part of British supply chains or what have you. But we don't need to go too far into that. But I think it's just worth pointing out that Bengal, when the British started taking it over in the 1750s, was richer than the entire United Kingdom. And what allowed them to take over was the sort of collapse of the Mughal Empire that had ruled much of what is India today. Not so much in the southern tip of the Indian subcontinent, but certainly that big band across India was controlled by the Mughal Empire. And after Aurangzeb, who I believe died in 1706, sticks in my head, there had been a process of decay. Not to say that everyone was getting poorer. Actually, some people were getting a lot wealthier, but India was sort of dividing off, and the British East India Company managed to go in and play in that environment and play very well and ended up winning. But it's just worth emphasizing that Bengal, there is a Bengali language. It is a long-standing subdivision of India that was tremendously successful, tremendously wealthy. Before the British, the Islamic conquests of India had also had a huge impact. There was a Bengali sultanate that stood for, I believe, centuries. It was very successful. One of the wealthiest places on the planet. Bangladesh of today is famous for, of course, its river systems and being very vulnerable to climate change, but that level of river systems and trade interpenetration made this, combined with industrial strength or pre-industrial strength, made it one of the wealthiest places on the planet. The British came in and killed the industry, subjected the local populations under a progressively more racist, as the decades went on, a system of domination and extraction, which was pretty awful for Bengal. Further, Bengal actually got ripped to shreds. Bengal was this nucleus, this center of British power from which the British went on to take over all of modern-day India, Pakistan, and Burma. The capital of Bengal became Calcutta. So there was a mix in Bengal of Muslim and Hindu populations. And as part of the British strategy of divide and rule, they decided that they would divide this historic territory of Bengal, partially in between Indians and Muslims, partially just because it was such a large and ungainly administrative unit that it did make some bureaucratic sense to split it up and make it a little bit easier. But that was actually one of the genesis points, one of the origin points of the modern Indian independence movement was in 1901 when the British administration decided to try to divide Bengal. And one of the great tragedies of this development was that actually the Indian independence movement, which at that point was quite united against the much more powerful British, was able to reverse the partition of Bengal. It was a tremendous early success. Unfortunately, as the independence movement proceeded and divisions between Hindu and Muslim citizens within India became more and more stark and more important, the British became weaker, so kicking them out was already kind of a fait accompli, and it had to be like, okay, so how do we handle what's going to happen between the Hindus and the Muslims. So we got to partition, which I think everybody is familiar with, tremendously horrific historical event that the British should have managed much better. So in the aftermath of World War II, the British are scuttling out the door. Unsurprisingly, the Indian independence leaders did not do a great job of managing the actual partition between Hindu and Muslim populations. You had horrific scenes of ethnic cleansings, mass murder. It is estimated that 1 million people were killed during the partition of India. Bengal specifically had serious problems with this, and the great tragedy here is that it ended up, the decision that the leaders of India and Pakistan arrived at was that they would more or less divide Bengal, this ancient historic province with a shared language, but different religions, more or less divided along the lines that the British had suggested in 1901. So Bangladesh, the independent country of Bangladesh, was without the capital of Bengal province that the British had put so much money into, which was Calcutta, Kolkata, what have you, stayed with India. There is in India today, one of the most populous provinces in India, or states in India, is West Bengal, with its capital Calcutta, which is, I believe, the 5th or 6th most populous city in India, a country with a lot of populous cities.
Yes.
So I think it's important to remember that at this origin of Bangladesh as a separate unit from British India, it was dismembered. It was dismembered economically, it was dismembered, and what became East Pakistan, before it became Bangladesh, was already just dismembered. I mean, you think about this, Bengal, this is a unit that has been, Calcutta was the capital of British India until 1911. I think it moved to Delhi for the last 36 years of British control. But from the 1750s to 1911, Calcutta was the capital of British India. All of the economic networks, all of the trade networks were organized around servicing, in Bengal, were organized around servicing Calcutta. And then all of a sudden, in 1947, they are part of two antagonistic countries. For those who just need a quick geographical statement, which I would have needed 5 years ago, you have India in the middle, the big subcontinent, and then Pakistan. Most of Pakistan is to the west and sort of to the northwest of India. Bangladesh, what between 1947 and 1971 was East Pakistan, has all of India in between.
Yes, a staggering amount of space. It's nearly like half of America from New York to the center of America is the difference between theoretically one country.
It is staggering difference of space and staggering difference of culture. West Pakistan, what is Pakistan today, is Muslim, and so was the majority of East Pakistan or Bangladesh.
That was about it.
But I mean, these were just they different languages, different. Couldn't speak to this, but I think you can. There are people who could make an argument that Pakistanis and Bangladesh, might have physical differences or what have you. I couldn't parse it probably, but it is a very different people. So in Pakistan, as was between 1947 and 1971, I believe Bangladesh or East Pakistan would have been by far the most populous subdivision of Pakistan. I mean, West Pakistan altogether, all of those very diverse provinces with very diverse approaches altogether were bigger than what became Bangladesh. So the story, I have very limited familiarity with it, but my understanding is that even before what is described by many as a genocide of the conflict between Pakistan and Bangladesh that led to the independence of Bangladesh, but even before that, throughout the 25 years or so that they were governed together, West Pakistan, modern-day Pakistan, abused Bangladesh pretty heavily. Tried to use it as a source for revenue and did very little, because Pakistan had a lot of its own problems. West Pakistan had a lot of its own problems, did very little to help Bangladesh recover from this initial dismemberment of its capital city remaining with India.
So Britain pillaged it, and then Pakistan and India then pillaged it even more, and Pakistan just kind of abandoned it and treated it as a place to rob from.
And I wouldn't be this invested in it, but I think certainly many Indian nationalists would argue that then it was even before that, it was the Muslim invasions 1,000 years ago that of course, Bangladesh is vast majority Muslim today, so there are not a lot of people in Bangladesh making that argument.
91% Muslim.
Yes, exactly. But it's exactly what you said. It's serial dismemberment, serial
assault.
Assault, yes. East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh, was tremendously poorly served by British hegemony, then the British exit, partition, and then it got to start off with what many describe as a genocidal effort by the West Pakistanis to hold on to the country in the late 60s and leading up to 1971. My understanding is through a rather heavy participation by India, the Bangladeshis were able to win their independence, which was certainly much deserved after this cavalcade of abuse we've described. But that placed them in 1971, newly independent, stripped of all the institutional weight that it had when it was part of the British Empire, that it had when it was part of Pakistan, and having to essentially start over as one of the poorest countries on the planet.
Yes, sir.
Vastly poorer than even Pakistan and India, which are not particularly wealthy countries. So this is a really rough spot to start out from. I guess people weren't talking about it yet in the 1970s, but certainly by the 1990s, people were talking about Bangladesh as the most likely, up there with Florida in terms of the damage that was likely due to climate change, likely to be a source of massive refugee flows, disaster. I mean, really looked like a country that was kind of doomed on a variety of levels. And what's happened since economically is kind of extraordinary. In 2016, GDP per capita in Bangladesh surpassed Pakistan, which must have been very satisfying. And then in 2019, GDP per capita in Bangladesh surpassed India.
That's outstanding, isn't it?
Yeah. And of course, these GDP per capita figures are always just estimates. Yeah.
Pinch of salt and all the rest.
Yes. But I don't think anybody's really disputing that dynamic. My understanding is that this is mostly driven by sort of sweatshop style textile manufacture. But regardless, that is a time-honored first step on the path to full industrialization. So the economic story of Bangladesh is surprisingly happy. The political story of Bangladesh is unsurprisingly a dumpster fire, just truly, truly a mess. And we are, at this point, in the midst of renewed mess, but I think a mess with some elements of hope. So I was kind of, I finally did a deep dive. I'd read some brief capsule histories of Bangladesh before, but this morning it really struck me that this country has been ruled mostly by two families for like 40 out of its 53 years of independence. It has been ruled by two separate families, which is kind of crazy.
Is it the Battle of the Begums?
The Battle of the Begums. Is Sheikh Hasina a Begum as well? I didn't.
I think a Begum is like a lady of rank. You see, so they're. Let me see who's the one currently in charge.
Well, none.
Yes,
but
was
Sheikh
until
Hasina,
recently. Sheikh Hasina is the daughter of the father of the nation, isn't that it?
Exactly. Sheikh Hasina is the daughter of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman.
Yes, and the other one, she was married to a previous prime minister.
Ziaur Rahman, which I think is confusingly two different families.
Yes.
But perhaps we are inappropriately ordering. I'm not sure how the ordering of surname and personal name goes in Bangladesh. But it is kind of crazy. Bangladesh is, I believe, still a secular republic, though there are disputes over that. It is also a fairly conservative Islamic republic. But since 1991, with sort of administrative breaks, the country has been led by a begum, as you say, by women since 1991, which is kind of interesting. And as you pointed out, the daughter and the ex-wife of two separate assassinated figures in earlier Bangladesh.
So it started off with the Bangladesh National Party until around 96, and then it goes to Awami League.
The Awami League.
And then they have a term, and then it switches back to the National Party. Then there seems to be a bit of nobody's in charge for a bit. And then after that, Awami League has just been in charge since, 2008?
So I think we joked a couple of weeks back about how difficult it was to understand French constitutional history. Bangladesh may be even worse. Confusing in that, like most British systems now, the prime minister is like most British descended systems, the prime minister is the most important figure. However, it does appear to be that for a period in the 70s and 80s, the presidents were more important constitutionally speaking. So it's all a mess. And also there's apparently enough knowledge that the changes of power are contentious, that constitutionally at certain points and extra-constitutionally at other points, there is an established role for a caretaker government in between elected governments, which is, I believe they are called advisors, chief advisors, or something along those lines. Muhammad Yunus is now, yes, the chief advisor of Bangladesh. Which is a position that was supposedly done away with by Sheikh Hasina, nominally as a democratization measure, but in a lot of people's eyes, in an attempt to consolidate power with her party. So yeah, things are very confusing. I read a somewhat poorly informed article in The Hill that was talking about how terrible it was that there was a transitional period and it was clearly just the military that was in power, with little acknowledgement that Bangladesh's political history includes multiple periods that at least look superficially similar to what's happening now. One government falls, there is a sort of generally conceded to chief advisor character, currently Muhammad Yunus, a Nobel Peace Prize winner that everybody loves. Yeah, so it is, I think this is just, what I'm trying to express here is that Bangladeshi politics has a sort of, it's a dumpster fire, but there are standard procedures for managing this dumpster fire, and we're not necessarily outside of the context of things that have happened in the past.
It feels like an incredibly civilized coup. It feels like they go through a revolution. It's like, right, we've had our 2 months of revolution. Sadly, quite a lot of people have died, but we've been through this before and sort of back to business by Monday. Like, it's bizarrely bloody, but like, okay, the blood time is over, now back to work.
So it's like Bangladeshi politics knows it's going to be a problem, so they already have this reflex or semi-constitutional approach to, okay, now it's time to clean up. Because Bangladesh is not yet back to normal, but they have put the people in place to try and bring them there.
I think famously a lot of the students attacked the palace, wasn't that it?
Yes, and have
took
attacked
some souvenirs just to take something.
Attacked a number of other things as well. So it's currently apparently operating as a country without a police force, which is not in fact the best thing in a revolutionary context. But so let's start with Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the Awami League, the party that was just ousted.
Which are considered to be center-left?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Though I was thinking about that a lot this morning. The party, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by Khaled Zia, the widow of the assassinated military figure from the 70s, is traditionally seen as like a little more right-leaning, definitely a little more pro-Islam. And the Awami League that just got ousted is seen as more center-left. Certainly the minorities in Bangladesh like it better. But I think looking at either of these parties anymore outside of the context of like their personalist nature, the way that they've just become vehicles for, I'm sure they're true to an extent, but really it's two similarly corrupt vehicles for authoritarianism. The political parties is sort of how I think of them. And perhaps that's a little unfair, the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, but I don't think it's that unfair.
Yeah.
So the Awami League was the party of the father of the country, Mujibur Rahman, who was assassinated in a military coup. The next person in power in the 1970s was Ziaur Rahman, the military figure that founded the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party and was married to Khaled Zia. the female head of the BNP that was the prime minister from 1991 to 96 and from 2001 to 2006. And is, I think, thankfully hopefully too old, to be trying to run again. That is something we probably do. Anyway, so back to the 1970s. This guy, Ziaur Rahman, I'm not sure the degree to which he was responsible for the assassination of the founder of the country or what have you, but he's the guy who ended up sort of consolidating the aftermath of that coup, was the Army Chief of Staff from 1975 to 1978, and then was president, overlapping from 1977 to 1981 when he was assassinated. So these are the founder of the country, and then sort of the next guy in power are the two guys who were assassinated. And the Awami League apparently, I think, predates Bangladesh. There was actually it was a successor.
Because they were heavily involved in the independence movement, weren't they?
Yes, and I think...
Which has weirdly come back to bite them more recently.
How...
The one of the things that caused these current riots is like a third of people have to be like get government jobs, have to be like part of this party. Or, you know, part of the revolution.
Successors of the independence.
Yes.
Yeah.
So people got a bit upset with that because it's just like, you know, jobs for the boys kind of.
Indeed. But I think the Awami League might have actually been an offshoot of a Pakistani party of the same name. So yeah, founding party, really associated with the family of the founding fathers of the country and Sheikh Hasina, who was just deposed. Then we've got Ziaur Rahman, the guy who consolidated things and that was assassinated, founder of the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party. And then between 1982 and 1990, we have this strange moment when the country was not actually run by a member of either one of these families. Apparently, Hussein Mohammed Ershad, who was still in Bangladeshi politics, despite getting thrown out in 1990, was still in Bangladeshi politics as late as, I think, 2014 or something along those lines. So apparently, you know, if you make it to power in Bangladesh, you or your family just apparently gets to be in politics forever, is apparently how it works.
Until you have to move to India.
Indeed. My understanding is that Khaleda Zia and Sheikh Hasina might have actually worked together in 1990 to overthrow Ershad.
That did happen. So yeah, they both worked together, but it seems that Awami League did more of the heavy lifting in that, so that's why they get more of the credit today. But yeah, definitely there was a time they worked together. I'm sure they know each other. But sadly, one of them got put in jail.
Yes.
What would appear to be trumped up charges.
I mean, maybe.
Yeah.
I think it's. In studying Bangladesh, I was not filled with an immense amount of respect for the political virtues of either of these women or their parties. So I think that it's entirely possible that there may have been some real weight behind the things that Khaleda Zia was charged with. So that's interesting you mentioned that the Awami League did the heavy lifting in throwing out Ershad, because after the elections, it was actually the BNP and Khaleda Zia that managed to stay in power from 1991 to 1996. Not too familiar with the transition between the BNP and the Awami League and Sheikh Hasina's first period in power, 1996 to 2001. Don't know the details there, really, or the transition back to Khaleda Zia and the BNP between 2001 and 2006. It does appear that there was a fairly extensive political crisis from the end of 2006 until 2008, in which there was not really a prime minister of Bangladesh. Instead, they had sort of a chief advisor that was trying to put things in place so that there could be elections. So I think it's just worth mentioning that an extended period of extra normal governance is well within sort of recent Bangladeshi history. This is something that happened between 2006 and 2008. And in 2008, 16 years ago now, Sheikh Hasina took power. There are many good things to say about Awami League governance, specifically that economic miracle that we talked about. But it is clear that whatever virtues there may have been, whatever legitimacy there may have been to Sheikh Hasina's rule.
Squandered?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but just to give a wee context, I do like my democracy index. And Bangladesh gets 5.9, So much better than the likes of, say, Pakistan, which is getting 3.3, but still a long way to go to meet the likes of India, which is 7.2. So not the worst, but room for improvement.
Room for improvement. So the Sheikh Hasina, after being elected in 2008, went through 3 elections with progressively less and less legitimacy.
And they seem to like put in more restraints around the opposition and other parties. I think there was an Islamist party got sort of banned and stuff like that.
But I think even beyond the boycotts and pressures put on certain opposition parties, by 2018, we're getting to elections that are just simply described as neither free nor fair. And I think part of the context in which these protests began happening in June is I believe there was another election in January of 2024 that returned Sheikh Hasina to power almost completely illegitimately. And I think that sort of desperation of like, oh gosh, we're really going to do another 6 years of this, or however many years was appropriate after the 2024 elections, might be sort of part of that baseline of desperation. I think the context of Sheikh Hasina is that there was, freedom of speech was being more and more curtailed. More and more opposition party figures found themselves in jail, including famously Khaleda Zia, the leader of the BNP. And it was just getting worse and worse. And actually, I think it's story of Muhammad Yunus, the guy who has volunteered, been sort of drafted in as the new chief advisor, as the guy overseeing the interim government, is actually pretty instructive. Muhammad Yunus is, outside of Bangladesh, seen as pretty unreservedly a good guy. This was a great choice.
Economist and Nobel laureate?
Yes, Nobel Peace Prize winner. Specifically what he's famous for is, I believe, his founding, or at least stewardship to great success, of the Grameen Bank, which is the pioneering microfinance institution.
Okay.
Which also may or may not have played a part. Recently becoming more controversial as we sort of fall away from, unified worship for market-based solutions and Reaganism or what have you. But I think Muhammad Yunus, even speaking as someone who has been falling away from the romance of those approaches, Muhammad Yunus is pretty gosh darn impressive. Microfinance is the idea that you go outside of the traditional banking system to provide microfinance. Incredibly small value loans that normally a larger finance institution wouldn't be interested in making, but can be transformative.
Was there an emphasis on giving loans to women? There seemed to be. I remember hearing about that they give loans to women and they're significantly more likely to pay them back than men.
Certainly, the idea that giving the mother in the village the money she needs to buy the cow or to buy the cell phone that she can then rent out to other people who can use it or what have you. A lot of heartwarming stories. This has been, I think it's possible to both acknowledge that this has been very good for certain people and has functioned in certain ways, but is also kind of definitely part of that. Well, we're not actually going to actually feed these people. It's going to be a market-based solution, which something that is beginning to leave a worse taste in my mouth, but it does appear that in the case of Grameen Bank, this instantiation of microfinance was a market-based solution that actually seems to have worked.
So this is the leader of the student protests, apparently said.
No.
No. Sorry, they've recommended him as well.
Yes,
any government other than the one we recommend would not be acceptable. So they really like this man and think he will have a great impact on the country.
Yeah, but what's interesting, and I think provides an indicator of just how authoritarian Bangladesh was becoming, was that for a decade, Muhammad Yunus, this internationally beloved, neoliberal champion, Nobel Peace Prize winner, was on the outs with the government of Sheikh Hasina, even though they seem to be fairly politically in alignment. He seems to have been, the man is 84, supporter of Sheikh Hasina's father. He's not like a member of the BNP who's like all about a more conservative approach. But because he was such a powerful figure, and by his nature, very anti-corruption, very interested in Bangladesh having the kinds of, rule of law situation that are necessary for the decent operation of a microfinance institution like the one that he ran from 2010. Really from the beginning of Sheikh Hasina's time in power, he was an enemy of the Sheikh Hasina government and the Awami League. It seems largely not because of anything he had done, but simply because he wanted Bangladesh to be run without corruption. There's actually saw some indication that Sheikh Hasina resented the fact that he got a Nobel Peace Prize when she felt that she may have deserved it for avoiding war when she came to power or something along those lines. And by January of 2024, he'd actually been sentenced to a term in prison, which is kind of crazy. I mean, it's like, I'm trying to think of a comparably beloved figure in the United States. I guess we don't really have any, but...
Well, could you see it as, say, like the likes of Bernie Sanders being put into jail? It's like, oh, you're looking too much of this helping stuff. Stick you in jail.
Yeah, it's kind of extraordinary, and I think that it seems to me like the Sheikh Hasina government kind of blinked. They weren't actually going to throw this guy in jail. He got sort of like a suspended sentence or so, or a house arrest or something along those lines. But yeah, in January of 2024, he was a convicted, I'm not sure if felon is the appropriate terminology for the Bangladeshi legal system, but he was a convicted malefactor, and now he's running the country, which is kind of fascinating. But I think that provides an indicator of just how not free and how authoritarian the instincts of the Sheikh Hasina government were. So we get to June of 2024. Sheikh Hasina has won an election. Seems pretty solidly in there. Bangladesh's economy seems to be on a bit of a downswing, but she's can point to a fairly legitimate history of accomplishment, probably feeling pretty secure. And then in June 2024, we get the I think it's the quota reform movement props up. This is a student or youth-led movement, very resentful over the amount of government jobs that are dedicated to descendants of the fighters in the independence movement from Pakistan. The Sheikh Hasina's regime's reaction was pretty outsized and negative. We have internet shutdowns.
Night curfew.
Yeah, night curfew. And this is a very sort of mid-20, from the European context, looks very sort of mid-20th century in a bad way, mobilized her own sort of student thug youth leagues or groups of thugs. So you actually had...
Over 100,000 arrests as well.
Yeah. So you not only had the police being pointed at these student protesters, but also her own sort of gangs of paramilitary thugs, which led to a lot of violence and a lot of death. I think the current estimate is that 500 or so people were killed in these protest movements. As is often the way, the outsized number of people killed broadened the demands of the resistance movement to the point where by July, more and more people were calling for her removal.
Well, yeah, it seemed to just be specifically this inherited jobs. And then once things got moving and the crackdowns became much more brutal, it was like, maybe everything you're doing is what we don't want.
Yeah, I think I saw something this morning that they called the 1 point movement. Like they have one demand, which is that the government resign and get out.
Yeah, I think like 13 police officers were killed in one day.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Yikes.
So what was interesting is that at a certain point, the police were just like, yeah, do what you want. We're not going to stop. And the military has been pretty, let me see, they seem to be facilitating the movement of power as opposed to setting up their own little government, which does seem to be a sign in the right direction.
Well, it's smart. I think the military facilitating this next government, not standing in the way of Muhammad Yunus, is just very intelligent. Because I think it kind of could have gone either way. A lot depends on whether the United States decides a coup has happened or not.
Does the fact that it's textiles help? Because quite often say it was full of gold you don't need that many people for gold. You don't need a lot of things working. You can kind of just throw in some thugs or, pay some mercenaries and get that resource out there. But I'm looking at their demographics for their exports, and it's like nearly 90% textiles. Like, it's shocking. But that requires a hell of amount of labor, a hell of amount of raw materials, a hell of amount of processing. So it feels like the nicer and calmer you can get things kind of going okay, you can get that money ball rolling again. Because it feels like if you do crack down like a military, textile's just dead. And now you're in charge of an impoverished nation.
That's a fascinating point, and I think is very interesting. Certainly, in the context of an oil-producing state, it's easier for them to be authoritarian and crush any movements. And also in the context of like sort of fully developed post-industrial states now, you can people talk about how labor is less and less important in, say, Europe, but especially the United States, and easier to ignore. Bangladesh does not have that luxury.
No.
It does not function. The money does not come in if the workers are not at their stations. And yeah, I think that's a really important dynamic.
Also, it's still quite archaic, sadly. Like, I'm seeing the thing about I'm following a lot about the Chinese electric cars, and they basically just cut down the efficiencies of making cars by a lot, so they're able to make them significantly cheaper, while in Bangladesh, this is still incredibly labor intensive.
Yeah. I mean, that's textile work, I think, in most of the world still is very, very much. There are sewing machines, but there are most often women sitting at those sewing machines.
And sadly, too many children as well.
Indeed. So on August 5th, August 5th, Sheikh Hasina fled the country for India, apparently just ahead of a number of rioters who may or may not. I'm not sure if it was a presidential palace or a family palace or maybe both.
Yeah, she has a sister in India, so... Oh, yeah. What was being attacked?
And it does seem like the story of Bangladesh over the past couple weeks has been sort of barely restrained disorder, and in some cases unrestrained disorder. Largely dealt with the fact that the very politicized Bangladeshi police force has been terrified, too scared to return to its job, because they are, every poster of Sheikh Hasina has been torn down. Some of the, her father's statues are getting torn down. Anything associated with the Awami League or Sheikh Hasina has been attacked. The police force of Bangladesh closely associated with the Awami League, and there's some indication that they're coming back in some spaces. But in a lot of cases, the student protesters have had to... There was an amusing New York Times story and video of a bunch of student protesters attempting to step in as police officers, not just patrolling neighborhoods, but directing traffic, all of which being kind of amusing and cute, but also a situation that you do not want to persist. It would be... I am not, by any stretch of imagination, a pro-cop person, but you want a country that is accustomed to having a police force to have a police force.
You don't want to recreate a Bangladeshi version of the Warriors.
Exactly. Yeah, that would be worth avoiding. And I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there's, unfortunately, where we're sort of seeing a irritating synergy between right-wing anti-Islamophobic protesters in the West and the burgeoning power of Islamophobic posters in Hindu India. I do not want to minimize the chances and the very real realities of some persecution of Bangladesh's Hindu population. There's 8% of the population traditionally seen as, I think accurately traditionally seen as, bigger supporters of the Awami League, which makes sense. The Bangladeshi Nationalist Party is about furthering Islamization. The Awami League is against that. So it makes sense for Hindus to be more supportive of that. I don't think there's any question that there have been attacks on Hindu folks. There have been some attacks on places of worship, this, that, and the other thing. I think what is also true enough that the BBC over the past couple of days has run a story on this, is that Hindu nationalists in India and Islamophobic right-wingers in Europe and the United States have been vastly blowing the scale of Hindu persecution out of proportion. Looking at this as an opportunity to sell a narrative of Hindu genocide in Bangladesh that seems at this point to be mostly nonsense. So yeah, we are in a position where we have a sort of transitional government being run by Muhammad Yunus. The details of this government are kind of fascinating in ways that I think couldn't possibly last. The student movement in Bangladesh, I'm sure fertility is plummeting in Bangladesh as it is everywhere else, but I think they're probably in the midst of a great boom of youth and student age folks, which is in part why we saw such a student-run revolution.
I heard you know when something just makes your skin crawl? What was it? The first Gen Z revolution? I was like, oh.
Oh, yeah. Good God. But, they, when the police force went away, the student protesters decided to come out and be the police. And apparently this interim government, Muhammad Yunus's cabinet, includes members of the student protest movement. Apparently, there was some talk of most of the departments of this transitional government having a student advisor as part of it, which is kind of fascinating. It's almost like the fruition of the dreams of like baby boomer protesters from the 1960s.
Yeah, it is like the fantasy of what you expect to happen.
Yeah, it's I think going much further than really most student protest movements ever do. And we'll see how long that lasts. I assume not very, and we'll see how it all goes. But I think broadly, this is a tremendously hopeful development. And I think a lot of people who pay a lot of attention to foreign affairs, revolutions, what have you, are just tremendously traumatized by the experience of the Arab Spring.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, specifically, that you were talking a little bit earlier about the military role, that the military do seem to be playing a rather large role behind the scenes. And I think in a lot of people's minds, I think of someone specific on Twitter whose name escapes me, this really brings up associations with the process in Egypt, where the Egyptian military sort of stood behind the scenes, facilitated a transition and an election, and then were like, actually, we don't like this very much, and quickly squelched it. And I think that certainly we should be concerned. Certainly we should be worried about every aspect of this transition or what have you. But we have to acknowledge that the Arab Spring, the Middle East and North Africa region, has a number of particularly pernicious factors that are not a factor in Bangladesh. And that specifically is the role of the United States, the role of Israel, and the role of the Gulf monarchies. There is not, in fact, a incredibly wealthy outside actor that believes it can control the region that is unresolvedly, implacably hostile to the idea of democracy. That's what
say that too loud, or Elon Musk will get on Twitter again.
Oh dear. Yeah, you always want to look out for that. But no, I mean, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, incredibly wealthy countries, did everything in their power to kill Arab democracy during the Arab Spring, and they were successful. In Egypt specifically, you had the added dynamic of the United States' favorite client state sitting on the Egyptian border and wanting to abuse Gaza, a jurisdiction that had some political affiliation with the winners of the first ever real Egyptian election. I mean, maybe there was more some slightly credible elections in earlier decades in Egypt, but yeah, and I think absolutely. I just generally, constitutionally, am not a big fan of revolutions or violent overthrows of governments, which is what we've just seen in Bangladesh. But you shouldn't go too far with that and just assume that because in a particularly screwed up region filled with the United States and our worst client states, things didn't go very well. Shouldn't assume that it's impossible for any country to have a decent democratic transition. I think it's very possible, and I think we could see a decent transition in Bangladesh. It's a really hopeful and 2024 is ending up as a really hopeful, impressive year for democracy in South Asia. We had the Indian elections where Modi was expected to really solidify his kind of post-democratic authoritarian power. Instead, he was humiliated as sort of barely hanging on as prime minister. Indian democracy looks much more vital. And Bangladesh seems to have shed itself of a 16-year autocrat. This is exciting stuff. Pakistan's not doing quite so well, but still, these are really positive developments that we should.
Maybe Pakistan could take a leaf out of their book.
That'd be nice. That'd be nice. Though
But it might be good to have
military.
some new blood that seems to be. Let's hope they want more transparency in their government and move things forward. Because when you consider this past government's been just trying to control and slowly become a more authoritative since 2008, it just feels like the next couple of years could be quite good.
Well, I think the big concern at this point, and possibly an argument that some are using for delaying elections, which I don't find particularly credible, is that if elections were held today, then sort of the instant winners would be the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, the already established opponents of the Awami League that has just been thrown out. And I don't know that anybody really thinks that would be such a great idea, other than, of course, the members of the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party. So that's a real concern. It's like, what if we just have a brief transition and then Khaleda Zia or her successors come in and just try to do what Sheikh Hasina was doing from the other side?
Maybe her son could come back from the United Kingdom, because I think he's been in exile as well.
There you go. That's a kind of a negative possibility. Not to say that the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party couldn't preside over a democratic system. It's possible. I mean, Congress Party in India is essentially a family-run affair and manages to participate in a vibrant democratic system. But I think that is something to sort of watch out for. But I think that the potential here is tremendously positive. And it's, I think, something worth celebrating. One note to close on is probably, and I think something that's very worth talking about, is the potential for persecution of the Hindu minority here. The Hindu minority is more associated with the Awami League that was just deposed, which makes sense. The Bangladeshi Nationalist Party, it leans more towards political Islam. It appears that there have been very real attacks against Hindu individuals, Hindu institutions, and that should not be minimized. That should be something that we all watch very closely. And in fact, it appears that the student protesters who've played such a huge role in policing the country and now being part of the government are actually acting to patrol outside of Hindu places of worship and other sort of affiliated facilities. So even they acknowledge that this is a problem and an ongoing problem. However, I think we can go way too far with this, and we're seeing kind of a pernicious alliance between right-wing Islamophobic elements in the United States and Europe and a burgeoning, relative newcomer arena of mass online Islamophobia. You have Hindu nationalists in India that are blowing this out of proportion. They're talking about a Hindu genocide in Bangladesh, which is not what's happening. Again, we should be careful people should be vigilant about this, should look out for this, but that the more extreme claims made by people who hate Islam from India to northern England do appear to be, at this point, largely farcical. And I just want to close, if you're interested in this topic, there's a BBC article talking about the far-right videos distorting the truth of Bangladesh minority attacks. This just came out just 3 days ago on the BBC. Well, I suppose by the time this broadcast, it'll be more like 7 days ago. But it's a BBC article, the far-right videos distorting the truth of Bangladesh minority attacks, that I think does a pretty good job of diffusing the idea that we've got some kind of anti-Hindu genocide going on in Bangladesh right now, which I think is a valuable thing to do.
I was going to recommend something completely different.
Oh, yeah? What was that?
Well, have you heard of the podcast Lions Led by Donkeys? They mostly do like military disasters. You know, they had a good one on Luigi, who was in charge of the Italian military during World War I, and just what an absolute monster he was. But they've done a series on a man, Victor Butt. What is it, Lord of War?
Yes, I tried to watch that recently, and it's very bad.
Basically, this man's real life is significantly more outlandish than that movie. But to the point where they're basically saying that a lot of when America or Britain would give weapons to, say, African countries, there was sort of a reasoning behind it. There was a certain leader they wanted to be in charge, and there was maybe a certain impetus they were pushing with. While Victor Butt just sold anything to anyone for anything. Like, apparently he was like the largest importer of frozen chickens into Africa because he was trading that from Afghanistan. So it's possible that a lot of the world and why it is in such a horrible state is thanks to this man, Victor Butt.
Oh, I think that's oversold. I think a lot of the reason why the world is as terrible as it is right now is because of United States and Soviet policy.
But they also, America also worked with them during the Iraq War on many occasions. But yeah, that's why surprising. A lot of the Soviet weapons ended up in a lot of these countries, because he would just sell it to anyone for anything. So I'd recommend, it's a two-parter, I'd recommend that.
So we're just doing recommendations at the end of the podcast now? Is that what
so.
we're doing?
I always feel like our endings are a bit abrupt.
I like the abrupt endings, but you think it'd be better if we recommended stuff?
I just thought a nice wee recommendation to ease the transition, but we'll see how it goes. It's up to yourself.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll do it this time. We'll see how it works going forward.
Okay, doke. Thank you very much for joining us, and let's hope everything goes well with Bangladesh and their new student party.
Indeed.
Ciao, ciao.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.